The False Memory Syndrome Foundation and Satanic Ritual Abuse. Dr. Martin T. Orne is the original board member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and a senior CIA Navy researcher at the University of Pennsylvania's Experimental Psychiatry Laboratory, as well as a close friend of Dr. George Estabrooks. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was created to deny the existence of cult mind control and child abuse, and is staffed with psychiatrists connected to the CIA and their mind control experimentation. The phenomenon of children being coached or led to invent tales of abuse or making up such stories does exist, but comprises a small minority of the reported cases of child abuse, between 2 and 8% of reported cases. One survey found 88% of therapists consider ritual child abuse to be a very real social problem. Only 5% of all child abuse cases ever enter the courtroom. Half of these end with the child returned to the custody of the abusive parent. Dr. Orne's research into hypnoprogramming at Cornell University in the 1960s was paid for by the Human Ecology Fund and the SEI Corporation, both CIA cutouts. This also funded the work of Dr. Ewen Cameron's brainwashing and remote mind control experimentation. CIA-funded black psychiatry at that time specialized in electroshock lobotomies, drugging agents, incapacitants, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and radio control of the brain. The FMSF founder Ralph Underwager and his wife openly advocate pedophilia, saying, quote, "It was God's will for adults to engage in sex with children." He told British reporters in 1994 that, quote, "Scientific evidence proved 60% of all women molested as children believed the experience was good for them," unquote. Dr. Underwager is the world's foremost authority on false memory, but in court is repeatedly revealed as a charlatan. Numerous others of the FMSF have connections to pedophilia, covert operations, and black psychiatry. Peter and Pamela Frade, executive directors of the FMSF, have been accused of sexual abuse by their daughter, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. The industrial production of FMSF stories in journals, newspapers, and TV have shaped public opinion on this subject. The very concept of false memory served the same purpose as Holocaust denial. Crimes are obstructed, the accused wears the veil of a martyr, and the victim is reviled. Dr. Douglas Berisha is the director of the American Enterprise Institute and former director of the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. He writes articles that attack the victims of abuse, and has been caught fabricating statistics when claiming scientific rationale for the basis of his statements. In 1986, Besharov published Unfounded Allegations, A New Child Abuse Problem, and numerous other cover stories to confuse this issue. These individuals are engaged in a psychological warfare operation to cover up reports of the CIA's mind control operations. For 30 years, the CIA has collaborated with cults, many of them founded by the government, in order to conceal the development of mind control technology. Dr. Besharov is associated with Irving Kristol, a veteran CIA psychological warfare specialist. Ritual abuse skeptics with CIA connections are covering up the latest phase in the agency-sponsored mind control experimentation. For 35 years, CIA scientists have collaborated with cults. The McMartin preschool child abuse trial is one such example of an orchestrated cover-up. The Children of God cult in Argentina has been involved in ritual abuse of children for decades, but has evaded conviction, despite voluminous, undeniable evidence and victim testimony. David Moses Berg founded the church in the 1970s, advocated using sex to entice new members into the church. His own children and former members have stated they were forced into sex between the ages of 4 and 10 years with high-level church members. The victims also testified to a sexual blackmail and infiltration campaign aimed at some of those most powerful men in Europe, quote, in the media, lawyers, and government, unquote. Powerful figures of political and financial support of the family include Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi, Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, and King Juan Carlos of Spain. The sect currently estimates its numbers at 300,000 converts in 60 countries. In 1992, the family's children's choirs sang in the White House for Barbara Bush to kick off a Christmas show in the East Room. The sect also sang for Bush after he toured the damage of Hurricane Andrew in South Florida. The Franklin conspiracy refers to a sexual blackmail operation and the savings and loan fraud that began in Omaha, Nebraska in the early 1980s. Lawrence King, a 300-pound pedophile, operated a national child prostitution network that catered to wealthy patrons of the Republican Party. King was one of the fastest rising stars in the Republican Party. He sang the national anthem at the Republican Convention in 1984 and in 1988. Lawrence King and his associates defrauded Franklin's savings of $40 million and used the residents of Boys Town and other children to videotape powerful and influential men and women engaged in sex acts with minors. These blackmail operations took place during fundraising parties for the Republican National Committee. Those involved stayed late for the after-party that included drugs and sex with minors. A component strategy of early MKUltra operations were sexual blackmail operations that targeted political figures in order to ensure continued funding from legislators. Victims who came forward testified that King and associates performed satanic rituals and human sacrifices. Many of the children who came forward with their stories have since been murdered or imprisoned. The most prominent and vocal victim has been held in solitary confinement longer than any other person in Nebraska history. King served 2 years for fraud and was promptly employed by his good friend, the editor of the newspaper in Omaha. The mass suicides at Jonestown of 850 people had similar threads, an apocalyptic cult with sinister connections. The leader, Jim Jones, had connections to the CIA. He had set up his utopian experiment on the same land that the CIA had used to train mercenaries to fight in Angola. According to investigators, quote, the Jonestown experiment was conceived by Dr. Lawrence Laird Layton, staffed by him and financed by Layton. The African-American cult had at its core a Caucasian inner council composed of Layton and his family. Layton was a chemist in the Manhattan Project and head of the Army's Chemical Warfare Research Division in the 1950s. The Jones cult took over the Mendocino State Hospital as part of a government pilot project to evaluate the feasibility of deinstitutionalizing mental patients. After a reduction in state funding, most of the patients at Mendocino were released into the custody of the People's Temple. Congressman Leo Ryan was assassinated in his attempt to investigate the cult. The pathologist in Guyana reported 80 to 90% of the victims' bodies had fresh needle marks on their bodies. Other victims had been shot or strangled. In 1982, survivors sued the former head of the CIA for, quote, enhancing the economic and political powers of James Warren Jones and conducting, quote, mind control and drug experimentation, unquote, on the temple flock. The Unification Church of Reverend Sun Myung Moon had close connections to the Korean Central Intelligence Agency since its creation by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. 4 of Moon's early leaders were Army officers with the KCIA. Moon's most influential aide, Bo Hai Pak, was liaison between CIA and KCIA, making numerous trips to the NSA headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. Moon's church is fabulously rich and influential, with at least 600 front groups. It purchased the Washington Times newspaper for over $1 billion. and the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut